Welcome back. We are moving into the 19th century, and we're going to talk a little bit about what was going on during the 19th century in America, and then specifically work our way toward the Transcendentalist movement, so you have a better understanding of what Emerson and Thoreau, there were other members of the movement as well, but Emerson and Thoreau, for our purposes, from our readings, just to give you a better sense of like where their philosophies originated and how important they were to American culture even to this day. So here we go. So we already have learned about the First Great Awakening and how important that was to creating a religious, like a religious identity that is uniquely American and is really tied up in nationalism. The Second Great Awakening just cemented that even further. So it began late in the 18th century and continued long into the 19th century. It was a series of religious revivals. So this idea that just because you may have been born into a Christian household and baptized and christened or whatever the case may be, that doesn't necessarily make you a true believer or a true Christian. So these revivals, I mean, I'm sure if you live in the South in particular, I'm sure you're familiar with this concept. It derived from this movement. I myself have driven by religious revival tents on numerous occasions, places like Easley and Pickens. So they're still happening, and the concept is still pretty much the same, which is this idea that one's relationship with God, the Holy Spirit, and Jesus needs to be revived periodically, that it needs to be constantly refreshed, almost like, you know, keeping a good marriage alive kind of a thing. It's not enough to just get married. You got to keep reviving things periodically to stay true to the faith. So again, this established a pattern of religious organization in this country that continues to this day. It's had a huge impact on the kind of I guess more evangelistic kind of Christianity that is pretty uniquely American. And then as many as 3 in 4 Americans came to have some kind of relationship with the evangelical Protestant churches that we know to this day, which is why you see so many of them in this country versus other places in the world. Like I said, in England in particular, like just based on my personal experience, there were Baptists, there were, Jehovah's Witnesses, things like that, but they were pretty rare. It pretty much was just, there was Church of England and there was Catholicism, and that's it. Whereas in America, there's a much more evangelical Protestant bent. Even evangelism, meaning that it's not enough to be a believer yourself, it's all about bringing other people into the fold too, and getting more souls and more believers. So this is really important as well, this idea that religion, like business, would thrive on competition between denominations, which, okay, is actually, yeah, it's a pretty capitalistic model, but it's also pretty true in a lot of ways. So like, again, if you only get the 2 main churches like they've got in England, Catholicism and Church of England, you know, they don't have to work particularly hard to get people in the pews. There's really only 2 main choices for most people, again, with some rare exceptions. But with American churches, this idea that like having lots of different denominations, and then if you're not completely satisfied with what your church is doing or how they're doing it, you are completely free to split off and start your own church. And the more that that's happening, the more they believe that like religious communities would actually thrive on that, rather than kind of stagnate and people get bored, whatever. So and with any church too, it's this idea that like, if you're not growing, you're dying. Like if you're not getting more people and more people coming week after week and building on and expanding and getting bigger. I mean, and you may go to a church that's really, really big, and like the whole idea being like, bring everyone bring people to the church, because it is a competition, and it's not a business per se, but it's, again, if more people don't come, then that signals that things aren't doing well for that church. So, and then we get newer groups coming out of the mix. They're not new to us, but at the time they were pretty radical, the Baptists and the Methodists, and they were very, very proactive about recruiting new members. So totally different than the way the Puritans were, where they were very exclusionary, it's all about keeping people out. Baptists and Methodists were all about getting out there and getting more people to come and show up week after week. And so for that reason, they ended up becoming the largest American Christian denominations by the 1820s, and they continue to really kind of hold that position to this day. They were also, and this might be on the next slide, but they were also the first to allow African Americans to become participants and even religious leaders, and so that's going to be really important as well. So this was important because, again, it's tied up in a nationalist identity and philosophy, and Protestantism provided a degree of common culture between a really disparate people, which is something America's known for. And most people at this time were at least somewhat familiar with the Bible and other Christian literary works. It was pretty unusual for somebody not to be. And this is really important as well. They closely tied the coming of God's kingdom with America's political future. And that's actually something that continues to this day. That kind of rhetoric continues to be a voice that is heard over and over again. It's going to be heard again soon with elections coming up. And something that people still fervently believe, that America is blessed by God and God's chosen, and that our political future is overseen by and blessed by God. So that all started in the Second Great Awakening. And it also, in a much more negative sense, it gave a religious justification for the westward expansion. So the Americans who were pushing further and further into these other territories were Protestant Americans. So into the more pagan areas, Catholic French areas, Spanish areas. That's why you don't, those places just, they have a history of being those territories, but they're not held by those groups anymore. So kind of like that manifest destiny idea that's going to happen later. This idea that it's God's will and that God, again, it's God's chosen people coming to bring his kingdom to fruition. So around this time, we also had what was known as the American Renaissance. So the word Renaissance means rebirth, right? And a lot of people I'm sure you're familiar with the European Renaissance, kind of a rebirth of arts and culture and politics and even like religious beliefs and everything. So America went through its own Renaissance as well, which, you need to be a country for a long enough time for something like that to happen. It just so happened they had. So this period lasted from the 1830s until roughly the end of the American Civil War, which ended in 1865. And during this time, American literature started to become an expression of national spirit. So, again, a kind of more nationalistic take on things. And there were three important groups that made up the American, were at the forefront of the American Renaissance, the vanguard, if you will. The Brahmins, and we're going to touch very briefly on them. We're not going to read anything by the Brahmins, but it's important to know who they were because the other writers were kind of reacting against them. So there's also the imaginative writers and then the transcendentalists. So the Brahmins, again, just to give you a little bit of context here, they were really the ones who dominated the literary scene. They were kind of the status quo in terms of literature, and they were called the Brahmins, and they were from New England, so kind of a fair Harvard, ivory tower kind of approach to things. They were aristocrats. They were wealthy. They had descended from the original Puritan founders, so kind of blue bloods, if in a way, like kind of, we've been here the longest, that kind of this many generations kind of snootiness that is, kind of harkens back to a more European way of looking at things than what we would consider a more American way of like, well, it doesn't matter who your parents are or where you came from. Like anyone can be whoever they want. But that idea is a transcendentalist idea, so just hold on. So they were the professors at Harvard, and kind of reigned supreme over the literary and intellectual movement of the day. They were very steeped, though, more as we've talked about in like foreign cultures. This idea that like, Americans are so crass and everything, and we need to be more like cosmopolitan Europeans. And so they really wanted to create, they were kind of embarrassed, I guess, by the folksy podunkishness of Americans. And so they really wanted to create a more genteel American literature. But that it was like based on kind of more of a foreign model. So it was really imitative. Like, see, we can be as genteel and cosmopolitan and erudite and fancy as any European can. So again, much more imitative. So this was, writers of note during this time: Longfellow, Lowell, Holmes. We're not going to read any of them because it's about as boring as you probably can imagine it is. And we're more interested in the other guys. So the imaginative writers, they were the following. So we already know there's our guy Poe down there in the right-hand corner. We also have Herman Melville, the picture of him. Well, it's like a cartoon, but he's down in the left-hand corner, the one with a really long beard. He wrote Moby Dick and Bartleby the Scrivener and a bunch of other stuff too. And then we've got, Nathaniel Hawthorne. We already know about him. He's up there in the top right-hand corner with his cool mustache. And then Walt Whitman, he's our guy in the middle. He wrote Leaves of Grass. I used to assign that, but in the interest of time, we're like Song of Myself and everything. We're gonna skip over him, though I highly recommend his work. It's really good. So Edgar Allan Poe, we all know him. He was an imaginative writer as well. So Poe kind of falls into a lot of different categories. So does Hawthorne. But they were called the imaginative writers because everything was very, as we know, kind of supernatural and imagination-based and kind of fantastical and stuff like that, versus like scholarly. And then our transcendentalist writers, we've got Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau. And y'all are going to be reading Self-Reliance by Emerson, and which, is it the most exciting read? No. It's pretty densely packed philosophy, and you'll see that when you read it. But there's a lot of really important stuff in there that I think everyone should really know about because, it's got a lot of what I like to call fridge magnet quotes about doing your own thing and marching to the beat of your own drum and all that kind of stuff. That's very, very American. So this idea of individualism and the importance of being an individual, that aspect of the American identity has a lot to thank Ralph Waldo Emerson for. So important to read in that way. Not good beach reading for sure, but important nonetheless. Thoreau is a little bit more, he adds a kind of a more imaginative twist on everything, and he's actually writing a lot more about real world things that he sees and deals with and applies the transcendentalist philosophy to that. So he kind of learned from Emerson, took the philosophies and then applied those to the everyday world and life that he saw around him. So I guess a little less esoterical in that way. So the transcendentalist philosophy. So I got a little image up in the right-hand corner that I think is a pretty good, quickie kind of representation of what the transcendentalist philosophy is. So it's got God at the top, but because it's a triangle and a circle and everything, there's the message there is that the three things are part of the one whole, right? So we'll get more into that: man, God, and nature. So again, this is a branch of the Romantic movement, and we've got 19th century writers, philosophers, and this is primarily happening in New England. So a lot of the places that Thoreau talks about actually are still in New England. You can go to Walden Pond; it is still a place. Who were loosely bound together by an adherence to a very idealistic system of thought, the human potential movement. So these thinkers and writers, at their core, believe that there is an essential unity to everything that has ever been created or ever will be created, that we are all one, not just people, but everything. Okay, it's a very, when we'll talk about the influence from Buddhism, but it's also a very, again, idealistic, positive take on humanity, that at our core, we are innately good, and that we have to have quiet to be able to hear our better angels. Which brings us to the supremacy of insight, about looking inward, and that the goodness will be found there over the logic and experience around us, that the deepest truths will come from there. So we'll pause right there.